So I guess I just start. Good evening. I am Lewis Gordon, and I am delighted to be here for a variety of reasons. You all probably hear this all the time. People always hear about Reed College, and it's one of those places where there are quite a few people who will talk about it, especially if you're academic. You'll hear about this august institution. But I'm one of these people who also answer emails, and when they've contacted me, we started a correspondence, and that correspondence led to this visit. So I begin with good evening, shalom, salam alaikum, and since I'm from Jamaica, simply how you keepin'? And I hope you're keeping fine. So the topic tonight is to talk about Frantz Fanon, and I see quite a few of you have some Fanon books, particularly Black Skin, White Mask. And if you have that work, I could be of some assistance. I'm going to talk a little. Fanon would have been 90 this year, and I ended up writing this book. And this book is called What Fanon Said, a philosophical introduction to his life and thought. And when you write a book that says what somebody said, and as some of you are students of literature in English here, you could probably guess the response would be, is it what he really said? Now, of course, if you're talking about what somebody said, you're also talking about what somebody meant. And what somebody meant, is it, did he really mean it, and so forth. And so as you write these texts, you'll find yourself going through an exercise that is paradoxical, especially when the author wrote in French. And quite a bit of what Fanon has been accused of saying are not only things that are a function of bad translations, but it's also a function of certain people's attitude toward Fanon. And I'll give you a sense of what I mean. First of all, there are a lot of really, really bad books written about Fanon. And of course, if you're going to say there are bad books written about Fanon, then you have the onus of writing a better book. But for that matter, you'd have to judge yourself. But what's striking is, with Fanon, he's one of these people whom a lot of people love to hate. And part of what makes it difficult is that there has been a tendency, particularly when you deal with an author like Fanon, that the tendency is to respond vociferously against the basic thing that he actually exemplified. Now, what do I mean? Well, the question is, why did I say write this book? Well, I'd written another book called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, African Diasporic Philosophy. And when you talk about Africana philosophy, there are some people, for instance, if you put the word philosophy and black together or philosophy and African together, would treat it as if it's an oxymoron. And that's because of the racist history of how, particularly in the Western Academy, we look at ideas. And to give you an idea about this, I had ended up writing that book, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, because I had refereed a proposal by somebody else to write the book. And that person wanted to write on Africana philosophy through writing a book that just simply looked at race, affirmative action, and one person in the Caribbean, and basically look at two thinkers in Africa. And my response was a 13-page, single-space critical review that said the problem with that is that that's not intellectual. There's a tendency when one is looking at black authors or ideas from people who are black to treat them as if the ideas are not what matters. It's actually more their biographies. And so when I finished my scathing review in which I said, for instance, even the question of Africa is a philosophical question. There's nothing even about the Afro-Arabic world, and I went on and on. The person who wrote the proposal wrote back to the editor and said, I think the person who wrote the review should be the one who writes the book. And I guess no good deed goes unpunished. And so they asked me to write the book. And at the time, I didn't want to write the book because I was dealing with other issues. But then I realized somebody else would write that book and probably do the same. People could get away with writing crappy books about the intellectual life of black people, and people would take it for granted. And this is connected to a very deep problem. You could notice if you go to bookstores, for instance, and you were to look at the Black Studies section, you'll see a lot of biographies. Even biographies that are written by children. And you're thinking, boy, you sure lived a long time. So what's going on there? Well, you see, biographies began to emerge when we deal with anything black because, as we know, there's this history of a thing called colonialism, racism, enslavement. And under those conditions, the idea was that black people as property lacked an inner life. You see? So it made absolute sense that there was an effort to try to articulate that inner life by talking about experience. And biography, autobiography, is one of the modes of talking about experience. Now, although that's a very good idea, the problem with the experience argument is that if you talk about experience, every one of you in this room, you have had this particular experience. And that experience is trying to figure out your experience. And you know what I'm talking about. Many of you have had experiences where something happened, an exchange with another person, and you're not sure what happened. And what do? You go and you find your friend or a confidant, and you say, you know, something just happened and I'm not sure what happened, and you talk it through and you try to figure out what happened. And if you think about this, what you're trying to bring to your experience is a theory, an explanation, meaning, something that can organize it to make it sensible. The problem, then, with looking at the world of color exclusively in terms of experience is that it had led to something particularly pernicious, because it meant that the theory, the search for ideas to make the experiences meaningful, if you look at a lot of what's done in academic literature, it came down to a simple thesis. If you want theory, go white. In other words, theory meant going to Derrida, Foucault, Kant, Agamben, Marx, all of those, is just presumed to be theory. And what happens then is we forget that those theories came out of the experience that those people were trying to figure out. But who says the experiences they had were the experiences of being enslaved, colonized, and made into property? You see what I'm getting at? So if you're going to deal with that, it's a good idea to look at the theory that emerged from people who look at those issues seriously. And in an introduction to Africana philosophy, I argue that to do it intellectually required examining three fundamental issues that such people struggle with. The first one is the challenge to their humanity. In other words, what does it mean to be human, which I call the philosophical anthropological question. The second one, for obvious reasons, is freedom, because if you're colonized and enslaved, you sure think a lot about freedom. And the third, and this is where the intellectual issue comes in, is the metacritique of reason. How do you justify using reason to deal with these issues, especially when there's a history of very, very racist reason? So within that framework, looking at those questions, I examined who were the people who looked at those questions, and I ended up writing a book that looked at women, men, people of different racial backgrounds. In other words, the old model says Africana philosophy is what is written by black people, what is written by African people. But that de-intellectualizes it, because not all black people think about black issues. And so when I began to look at that, I began to write a book that not only looked at 1,500 years of Africana intellectual history, but it also posed a problem in the philosophy of history. The problem was, how do you make appear as an intellectual production the work of people who are treated as if they lack the capacity to be intellectual. Do you see what I'm getting at? The moment you say Africana philosophy, many of you have experienced this. People say, well, is it really philosophy? Blah, blah, blah. Okay? Now that's not under debate. It's a whole area. There are people look for employment in it. There are journals, blah, blah, blah. But then the question became, what if you look at an individual? Now think about this. None of you in this room could imagine a book that's written on Kant, Descartes, Leibniz, Hegel, Marx, Sartre, Foucault, Derrida, in which the entire book simply talks about these thinkers' lives. Do you see what I'm getting at? If you're going to write a book about an intellectual, you need to explore the ideas of that intellectual. Nobody would ever think about doing such a book. Yet, if you look at some of the issues around Fanon, there were people who actually argued that what you should do is that the only importance of Fanon was his biography. And I'd argued in a book 20 years ago that if an intellectual is valuable, her or his ideas can be used to build and deal with theory today. So the very idea that people were doing this, Henry Louis Gates is one of them, but there are many others. There are people who are arguing, in effect, that Fanon should be de-intellectualized. The same people, including black literary scholars and black, social theorists who then would never dream of saying that about Foucault or Kant or any of those individuals, even though a lot of them, in their actual writings, particularly issues that matter to many of us, were not only wrong, but methodologically flawed. Think about it. Kant wrote, for instance, books about what it is to be human. He wrote and he never left the city of Königsberg. He said all kinds of things. He never did field work. He didn't know black people. And he just made these pronouncements. So did Hume. And that's taken seriously over a black individual who got off his butt, went to places, engaged them, and actually knew what he was talking about. That's bizarre. What's even more bizarre is some people also love to hate Fanon because, you see, there's already a grammar in racism that says something particularly pernicious. Particularly what happened in cultural studies in a lot of areas, it became really fashionable to hate black men. Now, what do I mean by that? If you go and you look into a lot of that literature, a lot of the problems become the danger of having black men as rapacious, as violent, as negative. A lot of that is written, and so Fanon, in some of that literature, became the representative terrible black man of the day. I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk at Princeton, and I'm the Fanon scholar and expert, and there was this historian in the audience who didn't do anything on Fanon, and she said with absolute certainty that Fanon was absolutely terrible, and she said because he called Maid Capacia a whore. And she said it with such confidence for a second, I believed her. Until I realized, wait a minute, I've read everything on Fanon. He never said that. And this is something you have to be careful of, especially young people you go on to graduate study, because you see, there are a lot of people who will not train you in excellent intellectual production. They'll train you how to be excellent BS artists. And what that is a person who can make things up, but with such confidence that people believe you. The other thing that happened was a very big book, big, thick, I call it, well, I'll explain in a minute. A very thick book was written about Fanon that a lot of people began to treat as authoritative. And that book was rather interesting because I gave a talk in Cape Town, and this book is this is the American edition. It's published in each country in local forms. And the reason is, it struck me that if you're going to write a book that engages Fanon was writing not simply to us in the academy, he was writing to people across the globe. And so it became crucial to make sure that his book would be affordable. So I made sure that in different countries the book comes out locally. So I was in South Africa talking about it, and a fellow came at the end and he said, you did 15 years of research. Why is it this size? And I looked at him and I said, because I didn't want to write a phallic book. And you know what a phallic book is? It's a book that's so big it's pornographic. And its purpose is to intimidate you with its size, because you say, if it's that big, it must be true. Well, the fellow who wrote this big pornographic book, a lot of people miss the fact that the book was designed to delegitimate Fanon. The book had sentences like, the only useful parts of black skin, white mass were the first sentence and the last. It had phrases like, if Fanon did phenomenology, it was not a very good one. Now, what's interesting is the author didn't do phenomenology. The author, in fact, didn't even do philosophy. He doesn't know these ideas. But you already know this. There's an arrogance that says, if you're white and you're published, then you know everything. And you could look at black authors and just simply say, without even reading them, that they have nothing to say. Now, if I spent my time writing about what's wrong with that book, the problem, of course, is that there are people who defend it without knowing what Fanon actually said. So it became very important to write a different book. And this is a little tip. If you find something's problematic at a scholarly level, you could spend your time writing criticisms of it, but it's a good idea to write an example of what's a better book. And that meant, instead of a phallic book, pick the central issues that could enable people on their own to build their ideas from that. So even though I could have written a very phallic book, I decided to write a book whose first and foremost goal was communication. Now, in that regard, some of you in this room, I'm just curious, raise your hands. How many of you have read anything by Fanon? Okay, most of you have. And how many of you at least have heard of him prior to this meeting? Okay. The reason I ask is, okay, what I'm going to do is give a very short statement about Fanon. I'm going to give a sense of, I'm going to try and say some things about Fanon that those of you who have read Fanon may not have known. And those of you who have never read Fanon, this could be a little helpful. And we can go through a discussion because some of you are doing such interesting work, as I've discovered today by hanging with some of you, that we could have, I think, a very wonderful conversation. So for those of you who don't know Fanon, Fanon was born in 1925 on the island of Martinique. Same year as Malcolm X was born and Patrice Lumumba. So, you know. Yeah, that year God was saying, you know, I think I'll make some revolutionaries. Yeah. He was from a family of 8 in which 2 of the siblings died, 2 of the girls. His mother was Black Martinican and Alsatian. His father was Black Martinican and East Indian. Okay? Fanon's, the island of Martinique was a very, it's typical of colonized areas, tiny white population, and the same as, and one of the things you learn when you read Fanon is Fanon doesn't separate race, sex, sexuality, and class. So one of the things to bear in mind with Fanon is that a lot of people look for Fanon to get a singular narrative of how you look at oppression, colonialism, or racism. But Fanon says the human being is not that simple. So Fanon, when he was the island Fanon was from, this island had a tiny white population, a very large mulatto population, mixed white and black, and a larger black population. And I explained to some folks earlier that this is one of the things about colonialism, why you don't separate colonialism from sex and race, because on an island that at that time had 1,000 whites, 200 female, 800 male, somehow 60,000 mulattoes existed. And a lot of DNA studies of the male line of people in the Americas reveal that 98% of the population, look at the NYU studies, right? Their male line goes to a European male. So, yeah, somebody was having a serious party during colonialism. Now, Fanon as a child, they used to tease him, call him Bergson, because Fanon loved to read philosophy books. But to give you an idea about Fanon, when Fanon was a child, he confessed to his older brother, Joby, that he expected to die young. Not only that, when Fanon thought about death, when many of us today think about death, we often think of the image black, but a lot of what we don't realize is that in a lot of the world, death, the image of death is white. And Fanon thought about death in terms of whiteness. Now, one of the things about Fanon is Fanon believed throughout his life that if something troubles you, you should confront it. For Fanon, if you don't do that, if you stay prostrate to that which you either fear or is a source of anxiety, it will enslave you. And this is something very crucial because, you see, that argument in Fanon returns in a lot of his writing. For instance, some of you, when you hear Fanon, the first thing people would say is violence. In fact, you say Fanon, before you even complete the word, they say violence, okay? But what a lot of people don't know about Fanon is that Fanon actually detested violence. Yeah. He was actually anti-violence. Alice Shirky in her book talked about it, but you don't need to read that book to see this. The thing is that Fanon, as born in a colonial world, saw the colonial world as a violent world. You see? And Fanon's position was that the person who says, I am a pacifist, I'm nonviolent, I will not have anything to do with violence, Fanon said that that was a form of complicity. Because for Fanon, if you are against violence but you don't do anything, then you're preserving a violent status quo. For Fanon, that's hypocrisy. If you're against violence, you must do something. But this is the rub. If you do something about violence, then you're in a relationship with violence. And this is something that Fanon comes back to later in his writing. In other words, the idea that you can be completely sterile, free, and innocent of violence in a violent world is a fantasy. Now, the thing about Fanon was that Fanon, because he took this position on death, when he was 14 years old, had a very pivotal experience. When he was 14 years old, a woman was hit by a car. She was killed, and her body was taken to the local church for an autopsy. So Fanon contacted his friends and said, yo, let's go look at the autopsy. And his friends were basically there. They said, nah, I'm not down with that. So Fanon went by himself, and he climbed up and he witnessed this woman's innards, everything happening, and it disgusted him. But what disgusted him wasn't the gore. It wasn't the vivisection. It wasn't the brain. It wasn't any of those things. What bothered Fanon was the dehumanization of this woman. He could not separate the woman from the corpse. Okay? Now, this is something very crucial. Because you see, moving quickly through his life, Fanon, when he was a later teenager, ended up going off to fight against fascism in World War II. And when he was going, one of his lycée professors said to him, Fanon, why are you going to fight a white man's war? And Fanon's response was a white man's war. No, this is a war against human dignity. Wherever there's injustice, wherever there's a degradation of the human spirit, wherever there's attack on freedom, I'll be there. So he goes off to fight. And when he goes off to fight along the way, he experiences a lot of humiliation and degradation. The first thing is, on the ship to take them to go to fight for dear France, the women and the men, and people don't realize this, women, Martinican women, had volunteered to fight, to be part of the resistance, to be part of the forces in that war. Those women were told what? As they went to fight for dear old France, that they were to sleep in the bedrooms of the white officers. Yes. The men were put in the hull just like a slave ship. When they landed in Africa, in Algeria, Fanon and them got off onto the continent. They were like, and whenever you have, because, whenever you have New World blacks who land in Africa, especially now they've read some Amy Césaire and Negritude, they're ready for it, the motherland. They landed there, they went up, hey, my brother, and the local African looked at them and said, Neger. It translated, it could mean nigger or Negro. And so they were insulted, and they found ways to try to say, no, we're Martinicans, we're different, got a special beret, everything. But along the way, humiliation after humiliation. And Fanon volunteered for the most dangerous missions. Why? Because remember I said he was concerned about death. His response was not to make death rule him. So he faced death. And in facing death, he dealt with quite a few issues of bravery. After the war, he and his fellow soldiers, black soldiers, were sent back ahead because they didn't want in the celebrations for people to see black soldiers. That happened in this country too. So they were sent in the hull of a cargo ship. Could you imagine that? You're fighting for freedom of dear France, you put in a cargo ship hull with modest rations back to Martinique. So when he came back, he met that lycée professor, and the lycée professor said, France, so you fought for human dignity and freedom. Was it worth it? And Fanon said it was a white man's war. He ended up working for Césaire to become mayor of Fort-de-France under the communist ticket. And as a war hero, he was entitled to go to France on a full scholarship. So he went at first to Paris to study dentistry. And I used to make this joke, revolutionary dentist. And you could imagine all the puns, right? But I kicked off this year, I wanted my first lecture in Fanon to take place on the African continent. So I kicked off this year in Nairobi. And my host was a man called Feroz Manji. And he used to be the editor of, Pambazuka and all the, he's a revolutionary guy. But it turned out he is a dentist. And so when I was about to give the joke, he said, what's wrong with a revolutionary dentist? Anyway, Fanon changed his mind from dentistry, and he ended up going to Lyon, where he switched to psychiatry. And when he went to study medicine there, he again confronted this problem. But if you study medicine, you know what you got to do. Anatomy. And when he was doing it, he discovered he still had that problem. Fanon's humanism was in his inability to separate the human being from the corpse. And he said he was really disgusted. He asked his professor, what can he do? And his professor said, pretend it's a cat. Now, you could imagine what the cat may have thought. Huh? Why not a mouse? And then the mouse was like, huh? And it just works its way down. But Fanon, while he was in medical school, and this is very crucial for you to understand, Fanon studied psychiatry, but he studied two kinds of psychiatry. So for those of you who know a little bit about Fanon, what you hear is that he was a psychiatrist. What you don't hear is that he studied forensic psychiatry and clinical therapeutic psychiatry. Now, why is that important? Because you see, forensic psychiatry, in effect, made him a medical detective. And if you read Fanon's writings, you'll discover that his approach was not only phenomenological, but he brought to it the eye, the precision, the search for evidence of a detective And he now found himself in an unusual situation. Because picture being a medical detective and you're called on the crime scene. But the crime scene turns out to be colonialism. The bodies are all around, the blood, the evidence is everywhere. And then Fanon discovers as he does his detective work that the people who committed the crime were the people who hired him to investigate it. This is a fundamental problem we have in the sciences, the human sciences, the academy, because you see the constraint that's placed on many of us when we're to look at these problems is to look at them so long as we do not actually follow them to the source that may be in those sciences themselves. You see? Fanon also, while he was also looking into clinical work, he wrote a book. He wrote for his doctoral thesis, basically a text, translated would be called On the Disalienation of Le Nègre. I prefer to say Le Nègre to deal with the subtlety in French. His committee promptly rejected the thesis because they were psychophysiologists and they wanted something that dealt with nerves. So Fanon basically said, okay. So he went back and 2 weeks later, within 2 weeks, he wrote a second thesis. And it was on Friedreich disease. And Friedreich disease is a spinal degenerative condition. But what's interesting is if you read the thesis, what he actually does is bring the ideas that are in that original thesis around a simple question. If you're dealing with a degenerative disease, you're completely dependent on other people to do everything for you, to wipe your feces, to everything, to hold your mouth so you could. You're completely dependent. And the question is, what is the role of the caregiver, the medical caregiver in that situation? And what Fanon argued was that we have to understand medicine not simply as being body mechanics, as trying to make sure you keep the body clean and all that. But he argued that medical care is a relationship and that health is about cultivating the humanity of a patient. Now, why that's important is because when he took his original thesis to a very famous intellectual by the name of Francis Janson. Francis Janson, for those of you who may not know, was a protege of Jean-Paul Sartre. And he took it to Francis Janson. He sent it to Francis Janson. Francis Janson loved it, called Fanon over and said, I love the book. I want to publish it. And Fanon said to him, you mean it isn't bad for a book written by a nigger? And at that moment, Janson went to the door, opened it, and said, get out of my office. And at that moment, Fanon smiled, and he said, we can work together. Because that's the way he was. He refused to be patronized, you see? And so he would only work with a white man who will stand up to him and not genuflect to the idea of petit nègre, you see? But the reason I bring this up is because you see in that book, which was originally entitled On the Disalienation of Le Nègre, Francis Janson said, I love the book, but I think it should have another title. So he suggested Pour Noir Masque Blanc, and that's why you have Black Skin, White Mask. So Francis Janson is the person who named the book. Now, that book is a book that's very, very, how can we put it? It's a brilliant piece of work, but it's a work that at its very methodology is doing things that require knowing the art of how to read Fanon. And so part of knowing what Fanon said requires knowing how to read him, okay? And one of the things you have to understand about that book is that it's an ironic book. On the one hand, the book has the author in the text, and that's the naive author who accepts what French civilization tells him or her. And that, in this case, will be Fanon. He accepts the idea that that society's for him. But as he goes through it, that means if he goes through each stage, he should succeed. But there's the meta-text, Fanon the revolutionary. And Fanon the revolutionary is saying to Fanon, the naive subject, you're going to fail. Fanon the naive subject is saying, no, I'm a Frenchman. It'll be cool. And so you could see this is a very strange text to read because you're really reading a doubled author. And if you look through the text, Fanon opens up by saying some very important things. He opens up by saying things such as, well, at the end of the day, you have to ask, and the way I translate is, what do blacks want? But to ask what do blacks want is like going back to the experience question, because to want is to have a point of view, to have desire, to have your way of seeing the world, okay? But the other problem, Fanon says, is this. When people try to look at racism and colonialism, they try to look at it as if it's phylogenetic, in other words, at the level of groups or species, or ontogenetic at the level of individuals. But Fanon said that between that is sociogeny. And by that, what he means is you have to understand there's a social world that produces meaning. Internally, there's no such thing internally to anybody to understand ourselves as black, white, brown, green, or any of that. All those things are functions of the human world, and it's how we're able to relate to each other. However, what Fanon reminds us are two things. First, we should remember that a social world is not like biochemical processes. It is produced by human beings. And the second thing he pointed out is that the category, the black, is a white construction. Now, if you hear you're a white construction and you don't want to be black, then you smile. And you walk out and somebody says, why are you smiling? You said, I found out I'm just a construction. So I have deconstructed myself. Blah, blah, blah. Well, if you go out in the world, a prime example of this is the publicity of language. And that's why in that book, the first chapter is on language. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of it because we don't have enough time, but a short version of it is this. Fanon shows that the naive effort to transform what you are with language fails. And if you fail when you go outside, you get battered, you get beaten up, what do? Think about when you were a kid on the playground. If you went and someone threw sand in your face or slapped you around, you go back home and you cry, mommy or daddy. And what you're doing is you're looking for love. So if your humanity is rejected outside, you look for the intimacy of inside. And when Fanon looks at love, he noticed that that world of racism and colonialism also fails precisely because in the search for love, it's a search not for love, but for whiteness. Now, he doesn't mean, and Fanon stresses this, he doesn't mean this is what every black person is like and every white person is like. In the beginning of that book, he says, for instance, that not everyone is in this text. And so Fanon goes through these series of failures. And failure is rather interesting because, you see, failure is so radicalized in that system that if you dehumanize people enough, not only do they fail, but get this, they even fail at failing. Now, you may say, what the hell does that mean? But this is what Fanon means by the zone of non-being. Because, you see, to be a human being, you have to have the capacity to fall. But if you have already fallen, there's nowhere to go. And this is what contributes to the social dehumanization of the people. Now, Fanon goes through all of these in Ponoames Blanc. Now, I'm not going to go through the details, as I said, but the short version, very quickly, is that Fanon then retells the story of failure through himself. And among the things Fanon does is to show how he tried to seek liberation through negritude, but his engagement with Sartre, and remember, Sartre is white, makes him realize that negritude won't work, and he begins to weep. And think about this, and I talked about it earlier with some of you. Think about a philosophical text written by a black man in 1951, published in 1952, in which he says he began to weep, to cry. You don't hear Hegel talking about crying. You don't hear Marx. You don't hear any of these people. But Fanon talked about crying. And the reason he talked about crying, and crying is a very powerful concept. Think about when you cry. When you cry, you wash away the impediments to your dealing with a difficult reality. You know, you want to wash away loss. And after you've cried, you may sleep, and when you wake up the next day, you realize the trauma is real. Well, Fanon looked in the next chapter at what's called psychopathology and le nègre. And what Fanon argues there is the uncomfortable truth, which is that a colonial and a racist society has no coherent conception of what it is to be a normal black adult. That's the problem. And this is a serious problem because remember, he's a psychiatrist. And if a psychiatrist, think about this. If you're in a racist, dehumanizing, colonial, misogynist world, and you're sent to a psychiatrist, what's the psychiatrist supposed to do? The psychiatrist's job is to make you well-adjusted to that world. And you see the problem? If you're a slave and you're to be well-adjusted to slavery, Fanon calls that an obscenity. It makes psychiatry the project of creating happy slaves. So for Fanon, the project cannot be then to make you a well-adjusted person under those conditions. You need to have, he argued, a healthy anger. Okay? And that healthy anger makes you realize that it's not about changing you, it's about changing a system, which is why he was a revolutionary. Now, there's something Fanon says in that book that's very crucial. When many of us look at racism, many of us, and you may have read many texts that tell you that the problem of racism is the problem of being the other. Have you heard that? People always talk about the other. Well, Fanon says you got it wrong. Because you see, at least if you're an other, you're another human being. The other is a human being, which means, as an other, the self has to be in an ethical relation with you. The problem with racism, he argues, is that it attempts to push a category of people outside of the self and outside of others. In other words, between the people who dominate, there's self and others, but beneath it, there are those who are not selves and others. And this creates a profoundly difficult situation. Because you see, if the system is legitimate with you excluded, then if you were to enter the system, what are you doing? You're violating it. So in effect, the problem that emerges under a racist and a colonial system is that it places politically categories of people who can only be legitimate if they don't appear. And you see the problem, what are you going to do? Oh, my life is really messed up. Let me change it. Oh, I can't because I'll appear. That won't work. And then it gets even worse because you see, if you attempt to appear, and that's a violation of ethics and justice, then every effort for you to appear is going to be read as violence. So in effect, you have to ignore the question of ethics and do the political work of changing the relations that will put you in a self-other relationship. So for Fanon, racism is not about being the other. It's about a failure even to be the other. Okay? Now, when Fanon finished that book, Fanon briefly went back to the island of Martinique. And the reason I want to bring this up is because, you see, at this point, think about who Fanon was. He's a medical detective. He's a therapist. He goes back to Martinique, and he could have been a wonderful bourgeois black man. He was married at this point. He had 2 children, one before he was married, and that's a whole other complicated story. And the second one was his son, Olivier. Now, the thing that is striking is he could have then gone back to Martinique and been a petit bourgeois doctor. But when he went back to Martinique, something happened. Fanon had, when you have a doctor like Fanon around, you have him do almost everything. And Fanon, being meticulous, began to investigate the medical records of the island. And he came across a very strange case. The case Fanon came across was of a woman who was listed as dying of an accident. But Fanon saw anomalies in the reports, so he had her body exhumed. When her body was exhumed and he did an autopsy of it. Now, remember, I told you, he detested autopsies. So the very idea that he's going to do a profession that get into a profession gets him to do this. When he does the autopsy, he discovers what? That she died from domestic violence. So Fanon began to press the case of trying to get her husband convicted. Nobody would do anything about it. He became frustrated, and after one disaster after another, he began to realize that he cannot, within that level, do something about the violence of the system. He had to continue his education, and he went back to France and studied to be a chef de service, which enabled him to be the overseer of a psychiatric facility. And that took him to Algeria, where in Algeria, he found himself in this horrible situation of treating torturers and those whom they tortured. He would have a case of somebody coming up and say, doctor, please help me. What's the matter? Oh, we had to arrest a man today. We dragged him by his ankles down the stairs as his head battered on the cobblestones, and then we broke glass and shoved it up his testicles, and could you help me, doctor? And then Fanon would go into another room and there would be a patient, oh my God, I'm still alive, but they dragged me down the stairs, they battered up my head, they broke glass and shoved it up my testicles. Can you help me, doctor? And there were women, they would do that too as well. So Fanon got involved with the FLN, and by the time, and to make the long story short, he became part of the Algerian War as one of the intellectuals of that movement. Now, there are many things about Fanon I could mention here. He became, for instance, an ambassador to Ghana during that conflict. And other things I could mention are the different attempts in his life. But one thing I'd like to mention is that Fanon also in Tunisia created the first psychiatric day outpatient facility on the African continent. He revolutionized psychiatric and other forms of medicine there, and he wrote medical papers. Why do I mention this? Because earlier I mentioned the name of a man called Michel Foucault. And what some of you may not know is that Michel Foucault had spent time with his lover in Tunisia, where he wrote Les mots et les choses, words and things. He also did work on the birth of the clinic. He did work on the asylum. And you see what I'm leading up to? It's impossible for you to be in Tunisia, a place with all those revolutionaries, a place that was challenging the very existence of how medicine was practiced in France, a place where the argument was that a lot of people were becoming mentally ill from political causes, not degenerative neurological conditions. That those were exceptional cases, but that many people were suffering from living in a sick society. There's no way you could be Foucault in Tunisia and you do not hear every second of the day Frantz Fanon. But many of you know, when you read those writings, there is no mention of Fanon whatsoever. Now, there are reasons for this, and one of them is the Algerian War was a bitter war, and France wanted to forget Fanon and many others. But that made Fanon a liability if you were looking for professional advancement. And so there became the systematic effort to erase Fanon. Now, Fanon, unfortunately, took ill with leukemia. And if you think about what leukemia is, which is blood cancer, the idea that it affects the white blood cells, the fact that it could have had a genetic origin, and he was a mixed race, if you want to use that language ban. Think of the irony, especially if you think of the old language on race. The old language of race was, well, I am of black blood, white blood, Indian blood, 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 blood. So the idea that he was dying from blood cancer, how profoundly weird that must have been. He was taken to this country, and the only way he could get here was through the CIA. And the CIA wanted Fanon bad because Fanon knew every revolutionary and so forth. But what they didn't know, that part of his work for the FLN was to train people on how to resist torture and not to give information. So when they got him to Bethesda, Maryland, and by the way, the CIA agent who did this is very public about it, and he talks about this. So, because he ended up liking Fanon a lot. he was brought to Bethesda, Maryland, where on December 6, 1961, he died. There are a lot of details in between, but, that's there. Now, the reason I bring, and then his body was taken back to Algeria, where it's buried. Now, the thing that's very interesting and important for us to consider here is before Fanon died, right, the period just before he came to the United States, there was a very unusual circumstance. One of them was Fanon decided to write Le Damné de la Terre, okay? Properly translated, it's the damned of the earth. Wretched has a different connotation in English, and I really hate that title. But nevertheless, that's what it's known as, but it should be the damned or the condemned of the earth. Jean-Paul Sartre agreed to write the foreword to it. Now, Fanon didn't need Sartre to write the foreword. When Fanon wrote Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, it was banned, but it sold out in 2 weeks. He was known he didn't need it for sale, so why would Fanon ask Sartre to write the foreword to this book? And one of the things about Fanon was critical of some of the things he saw when he was looking through different parts of Africa at the newly independent states. He saw a certain form of nationalism and definitely racism as one of the great obstacles to revolution. And so Fanon wanted to have, for people to see this, the most famous at the time living white philosopher and him together in this book. However, remember I said that Fanon saw death as white? Before Fanon came to the United States, there was a period while he was in delirium, hemorrhaging, that Jean-Paul Sartre went and visited him. And Sartre sit next to his friend's suffering body, his condition as he was there, for 6 hours, just sitting there next to the suffering Fanon. And that's a beautiful story of friendship and devotion. But remember I said that Fanon saw death as white? So although Sartre was being such a good friend, Fanon was looking up at this white Grim Reaper before he left. Now, one of the other things to bear in mind is if you read Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon also had a criticism of Sartre. And it's important criticism to understand when you look at look at Le Damné de la Terre. Because what Fanon said was that when Sartre criticized negritude as a minor term in a dialectic that was leading to the revolutionizing of blacks to join the universal working class struggle, Fanon said, I didn't need to know that. He said, Sartre forgot that the negative dialectic has to get lost in the night. But what Fanon was saying was something even more profound. And this is very important when you read people like Sartre and others, because you see, whenever we think, remember that earlier point I said, whenever you think of a black author, people always want to subordinate the black author in terms of a white author. If you look at a lot of the bad stuff on Fanon, they want to find out if Fanon is Hegelian, Marxist, Gramscian, Sartrean, Lacanian. Instead of just reading Fanon. I mean, it's possible for Lacan to read Hegel and nobody asks if he's a Hegelian. It's possible for Hegel to read Kant and nobody calls Hegel a Kantian. It's possible for Marx to read Hegel and nobody calls him a Hegelian. And it's possible for Sartre to read Bergson and Hegel and Husserl, and they don't call Sartre Husserlian, Hegelian, and so forth. But the moment a black thinker uses any idea of a white thinker, you subordinate the black thinker to the white thinker. The thing about Sartre that many people didn't know and didn't realize is that Sartre really took the ideas of young people seriously. And the reason I bring this up is back to why I brought up Francis Janson. Because you see, Janson, as a protege of Sartre, had to have shared that book with Sartre. And in fact, Fanon knew Sartre in other contexts. And Sartre must have read that and realized, oh my God, I am articulating a closed dialectic. In other words, Fanon's critique of Sartre's dialecticism is that it was not dialectical because it was closed. And for those of you who are interested in Sartre, In the 50s, right after that period, Sartre began to rethink the question of method and dialectical thinking, and he wrote a big book called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, 2 volumes in which his main thesis is that orthodox Marxism in his society was actually closing off the dialectic. And that an open dialectic means you don't know where it's going, but you need to work out the contradictions. Now, why this is very important is because in Le Dernier de la Terre, Fanon does quite a few things that would be very important for you to consider. One of them I've already hinted at. The problem is, Fanon said, decolonization is always violent. Why? Because if you think about a settler, if you think about all forms of colonialism, if you think about racism in the United States, the people who are dominant never say that what they have acquired is unjust. And so if you're going to fight a revolution and for social change, you have to change what people think is just. And that means you're going to be interpreted as violent. And Fanon says to spend your time trying to persuade them you're not violent is a waste of your time, because the only thing they'll accept is if you do nothing. That's the complicity I talked about earlier. But Fanon also examined something that was very dangerous. You see, a lot of people today love to say decolonization. But what Fanon argued in Le Dernier de la Terre is that decolonization is a stage. You don't want to stay in the decolonization moment. Why? Because think about it. For you to continue decolonization requires the continuation of colonization. The task is to go beyond colonization. Now, I could illustrate this in a very different way. If any of you are Jewish in the room, and if you're not, you probably know this story. When Jews have a Seder, in the Seder, you go through talking about the Exodus and all of that, and a crucial point comes in the story. The crucial point in the story was, or rather is, why didn't Moses enter the Promised Land? You're going to spend 40 years doing all of this, so forth. You're right there. It's time to go in, and you don't enter the Promised Land. Now, the theological explanation is very straightforward. Just when they were to go into the Promised Land, Moses got angry at the Israelites, and he said, "How can you be doing this? Look what I did for you." And according to the story, God said, "You did what? You didn't do shit. God did it." You see what I'm getting at? Now, that's the theological version. However, think about it as a political story. What if Moses did go into Promised Land, and you're trying to set up a new society? How are you going to build a society when Moses is around? "Yo, Moses, I think we should." And Moses says, "Nah, I don't think so." "But Moses," and he says, "You see this?" He holds up the staff. Red Sea. "But Moses," you see what I'm getting at? The problem is Moses entering the Promised Land would be a political disaster. It's his absence that enabled Aaron and the others to build. Now you look at what's called post-colonial societies. A lot of post-colonial societies are governed by the people who are engaged in the decolonization process. The problem is that their legitimacy depends on saying they're fighting against colonialism, and so they need to keep the people in perpetual fear of colonization. What Fanon argues, however, is that a different generation has to develop who is not organically linked to the decolonization moment. That other generation has to be indigenously linked to where the society is going. And to make his point even more clear, if you read Le Dernier de la Terre, the support for this is something very curious. If you read that book, you'll find just before he ends the book, he has a chapter on disorders during the period of decolonization. He tells the story of a man, And all of the people who commit these atrocious acts of violence are Algerian, Berber, or Arab. He talks about a man who was thinking about the death of his mother and vivisects a woman. He talks about some little boys who are playing with their white French friend, take him to the side and kill him. Now, if you want to valorize violence, that's not going to be the best way to do it. What Fanon was trying to say is that these are people that violence produces trauma. You see? And when you think about trauma, there are two kinds of trauma, as Freud pointed out. There is ordinary trauma. You know what ordinary trauma is? Life. When you get up in the morning, if you have any idea from the standpoint of physics, just as a physicist, what your body goes through every day, just walking, you know what I mean? From the standpoint of physics, your body is just boom, bam, boom, boom. That's why we got to sleep. Because when we sleep, we're actually restoring ourselves. But that's ordinary trauma. But then there's the other trauma, the dehumanization, the humiliating trauma. The trauma of seeing your mother exploded in front of you from a bomb. The trauma of seeing your child's head blown open. The trauma of you being raped, tortured. That is not something you say, okay, I had a little trauma. That is something that has marked you, scarred you. And that can and Fanon asks, do you want people with that kind of scar, those scars, setting the foundations of your future? What those people need is not to govern, Fanon argues. They need therapy. And this is something we often overlook. So Fanon, when he ends, he does something rather powerful. And this is a theme through all of Fanon's writings. In my writings, I compare it to what you see in Dante's Inferno. You all know the story of Dante's Inferno? Virgil guides through different layers of what, and at the center, at the very center of hell, it's cold. Why? It's the greatest distance from God. And at the center, there are these two men, frozen from the neck down, but one of them hates the other so much he stretches over and he chews on the head of the other one. And when the protagonist sees this horrible sight, because he himself was consumed by hatred, he lets go. And when he lets go, Virgil takes him outside where he looks in the sky at dawn and sees the stars. That's a theme in Fanon's writings. Because what Fanon says at the end of Le Dernier de la Terre, and he says it in Panorama Blanc, is that at the end, you need to build new concepts, and he says to set afoot a new humanity. But the thing about building that new concept, those new concepts, that's the crucial thing. For Fanon to build those new concepts is in the hands of those who are able to see and have an indigenous relationship to the new set of problems. So in effect then, in Fanon's writings, they all come down to the question that he raises consistently. The question is about what does it mean to be actional, actually to do things. And for Fanon, it's not about having these preconceived, closed dialectical notions. It's about opening it up and taking responsibility on the future in which one's actions depend. Which means for Fanon, and he says this very well, it means then that everybody in the younger generation, which means you, that whether you like it or not, the future does depend on you. But the thing for you to do is to understand your indigenous relationship to the problems at hand. And when you think about it, although you may read books about political problems from the past, whether it's through people such as Gramsci or whether it's people you're going to read such as, somebody like Lukács, or you're going to read someone like C.L.R. James and all of those. What they all remind you is of something very important from the Black radical tradition. The Black radical tradition, in a nutshell, comes down to several important theses, but two of them are, one, why we can't wait. In other words, if you wait for the conditions for social change to be those that fit another group of people, you'll be waiting forever. What you have to do is make the social conditions for the change at hand. And the second thing that comes out of this, that Fanon argues, is something that militates against the concept of forecast. For Fanon, the issue is not for you to know what the outcome will be. It's not for you to have a guarantee. It's not for you to say in advance, as pessimists do, well, it's not going to work. For Fanon, if you're going to deal with social transformation, the real question you should ask is, are you committed to that change? And the reason you ask this, if you go back to the Moses story, is because if you're involved in political action and questions of social transformation, questions of revolution, questions of social change, you must remember that it is not about you. The reason this classroom could look the way it looks today, the reason I could even be talking to you today, is because some people who have never met me and could never have known I or you would exist, in their time did what needed to be done. And they didn't know the outcome. And so for Fanon, that's the thing to bear in mind, to understand your relationship to a struggle and to understand the commitment that transcends the question of whether you individually benefit from it. And you know what you call that, don't you? Love. Thank you. How long are we supposed to be? It's a little longer, but I just figure I don't see you often, and you may want to know a little more about Fanon. When are we supposed to stop?
I think we have till 9.
Okay.
It's not positive they'll kick us out immediately. They might
Okay. Okay. Oh, there's food. No.
cookies and tea.
Okay. Well, don't worry. I also do Kung Fu. I'll protect us. If you have any questions, please just say your name. And you know what? I'll actually love to hear from a lot of you. So instead of one person and I answer, if you have thoughts or questions, could you each just say something? And that way I could respond to it so we could have more time if we want to, because some people don't like to speak in front of an entire room. So if you have a question or a thought, could you please say it and just say your name? Yes, what's your name?
It's Jorge.
Hi.
Hey, I haven't read Fanon in a couple of years, but I'm interested in the notion of indigeneity, and I guess the way he formulates it, because I guess, I don't understand. It seems the way that he characterized it, it seems that this indigeneity has to do in relation to the proximity of the struggle at hand. I don't know if he thinks about it more like in a kind of like relationship to land, or like the kind of claims that you can have to that struggle as taking it for your own.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's
No, you're very clear. That's very good. Next. Yes.
Similar. Does he have any concept like Gramsci with common sense? Does he like kind of have this broad scope of I don't know, some like placeholder term for just I don't know, things that are locked in
Got it. Cool. Next, we do the Jeopardy. Yes. Sophie.
Yeah, that's me. So since colonialism and racism are systems that persist, is it possible to deconstruct those systems if we're going beyond, if we want to go beyond decolonization? Or, or do we have to deconstruct those systems? Does that make sense?
Cool. Anybody else? Yes.
My name is Jeff. I'm interested in the question or the dialectic that you brought up between biography and intellectualism. And if we're thinking about working through trauma, what do we as philosophers have to do in terms of doing our own psychological work in order to get to the point of being able to think about something like say, reconstructive or post-colonial sense of politics or philosophy.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, the first thing is the way I was using the question of social indigeneity, I was talking about social indigeneity, okay? So for instance, what we have to understand is you live, for instance, in 2015, and all of the conceptual issues, you live in a world in which the planet is smaller, 8 billion people. The technological resources make time speed up. And there are all kinds of issues, for instance, the idea of global ecological disaster that make the kind of questions you have to deal with very, that's linked to your generation in a way that's different from others. Now, when it comes to indigeneity, Fanon actually, there's another concept of indigeneity, which is a very problematic one, and that's the one that created the concept of a native, okay? And Fanon was very critical of that, but not only him. I'm critical of that and many others. Franz Boas, the anthropologist, was critical of that. Antonin Fanon, there are many people who are critical of that. And what a lot of people don't know is that what created natives was actually colonialism. And what created even the notion of primitives was colonialism. You know what? There aren't any primitives. Do you know what the concept was about? The concept of a primitive is based on like primordial. It means literally people who do not properly belong to this time. Now, if you think about it, when colonialism, the moment of colonization occurred, say when Columbus, as an example, met the Tainos, right, on the island of Haiti. When he showed up there, he was in the time of Christendom. They were in the time of the Taino world and what they lived in. But when they met, those times were shattered. You see what I'm getting at? Because now the organization of one group's time is in terms of this dialectical struggle for the future. And if you think about Native Americans, that's a good example. Native Americans, nobody in this country takes the position that this land is going to be returned to Native Americans. And that investment in that concept pushes the concept of Native Americans into the past. But that creates a problem because Native Americans are still here. So what do you call a being that's still around when it's supposed to be in the past? And the answer is a ghost. So what happens is, it's no accident that a lot of the iconography of Native Americans have a kind of hauntology, a kind of ghost-like character, because the presumption is that they will not be in the future. Now, of course, for Native Americans, it's a very different issue, just like for the people we call Native Africans and all of those. The idea is to be in the future. What the Arab people make is that they think they have to be in the future as an authentic version of the past. But no, the conflicts they're involved in are actually conflicts that make them very much in the modern. But the error we make is that when we say the modern, we don't correct it and say we're really talking about the Euro-modern. Because you see, the effort to continue existing and actually to transform and to deal with the transformation of the world in terms of liberation, that's the Afro-modern, that is the Indo-modern, that is the Sino-modern. You can keep going down the list. There are different kinds of moderns. Now, within that framework, this question then of how you belong to an issue does connect with Gramsci, and in fact, in my analyses, I do bring up Gramsci there. But the important part is to bring up Gramsci not as the legitimation of Fanon, but as someone who is a co-thinker on this problem. What's often not understood about Gramsci is that some people look at Gramsci as an identity argument. But that's not what Gramsci is doing. Gramsci is doing a praxis argument. And the praxis argument is this. You may be born in a group, but the actual intellectual and political projects you have may be antithetical to that group. If it's antithetical to that group, although you're born in the group, you are not organically linked to it. You could be born outside of a group, but if you're involved in the struggle for their liberation, that is organically linked to them. And the task is to figure out what is organically linked to the very questions and the struggles at hand, okay? And so that aspect of Gramsci is something that Fanon shares. They both have that argument. Similarly, the argument, what's interesting with Gramsci is that he does not collapse into the closed dialectic because of his critique of common sense. His idea of critical philosophy, for instance, is one in which different generations have to bring their common sense into critical focus. And so Gramsci and Fanon can actually work together pretty well. There are points at which they diverge because Gramsci bought into the notion of a savage, of the primeval, of the primitive, and that's where they would part company. Now, as we begin to think about these issues, I'd like to introduce you to a concept of a concept I write about called disciplinary decadence. Okay, and what disciplinary decadence is the organization of knowledge in such a way that you treat that organization, whether it's as a discipline, right, or as a field of study, as complete, as in effect like a god. And if it's created by God, it means its methodological resources are also complete. And what happens there then is that you now don't have to look at reality and the relationships you have with the world. You simply have to look at the methods. And because you look at the methods, and I call it the fetishization of methods, what happens is you turn away from reality. However, what happens in that situation is not only do you treat your discipline like a god, but the more you turn from reality, you push yourself outside of relations, which eventually then leads to decay. Because you see, what creates methods in the first place was an effort to establish and figure out some relationship with reality. So that means one has to reorganize the question of reality, but if you do that, it may mean that you have to go beyond the discipline itself. And going beyond the discipline, I call transdisciplinarity. Now, this going beyond the discipline, right, takes a form of what I also call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. And what that means in a nutshell is that for the purpose, it sounds very daunting, teleological suspension of disciplinarity. But what it means is this: there's a paradox. Whenever any discipline pays attention to reality, it has to be willing to let go of the discipline. And when it takes that leap toward reality, it may encounter a relationship with other disciplines. Now, some people call that interdisciplinarity, but that doesn't work because other disciplines may treat themselves as hermetically sealed holes. And so they're like ships passing in the night. What's needed is the actual communicative practice, to communicate with each other, which means that there are things you let go of and things you bring on. Now, this relates to the question, you see, the example, it wouldn't be deconstruct, because the problem with, if you say de-construct, the thing, well, that is more like decolonization. There's another kind of deconstruction, like Derridian deconstruction, but Derridian deconstruction is something very different. Derridian deconstruction is dealing with pointing out the points of undecidability that can have simultaneously operating valid narratives. And what creates danger is if you take each narrative so seriously that you fail to see that they can each work. So that's why Derrida talks about playfulness. He has a profoundly existential, critique there. And what's funny is in France, a lot of people read Derrida more in terms of existentialism. It's in this country, because of the way they read post-structuralism, they want to create a distance from existentialism in Derridianism because they are connected to all this post-humanism and all these other things. However, if you notice, earlier I said decolonization is a necessary condition, but it's an insufficient one. And the best way I could illustrate this is if we see a connection between someone like Fanon and someone like Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, as many of you know, has this wonderful phrase, the master's tools will never tear down the master's house, right? So a lot of people hear that and they say, don't use the master's tools, blah, 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 blah. But they misunderstand her. And what do I mean by they misunderstand her? Well, let's just start with tools. You know, one of the things that many people don't know is that the masters didn't have many tools. Why? Well, what created prosperity in this country was the fact that the people who were enslaved had a lot of tools. You see, when we think about slavery, the stereotype, because a lot of the actual the actual history is being told by those who are ashamed of its existence. They misrepresent enslaved people. So the stereotype, if you may have, of an enslaved person is just brute labor. Somebody's just walking in the bush in Africa, kidnapped, brought on a boat, came to America, work. But that is not actually what happened. See, the African continent was a vast system of trade networks, states. It's a continent in which there is 220,000 years of the history of our species. The people who were being enslaved were skilled labor. And when you think about what happens if you take skilled labor from one place and put it in another, it's not, even if they're pissed off that they're enslaved, it's not like they're not going to use their skills, especially if it'll make their lives easier. And that's why so many inventions that happened in the United States and in Canada, well, but more the United States and the Americas, were actually inventions by enslaved people. In fact, if we were to start and eliminate the amount of things that were invented by black people, just black people as an example, there are many others, but just black people, we wouldn't be able to get through a single night. For instance, you couldn't get out that door because the doorknob was invented by a black person. You couldn't be able, the lights wouldn't be on because the filament was invented by a black person. You wouldn't be able to, of course, if you got in your car, drive it because the brakes were invented by a black person. The stoplight was it, the toilet. You keep going. The cotton gin, it wasn't Eli Whitney. It's just that a slave couldn't own the patent. So Eli Whitney got the credit for what his slave invented. If you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, the reason Solomon Northup had all those knowledge of irrigation techniques was because his father was from Africa and taught him that. It's in the actual, if you read the actual autobiography. Now, and the other thing, by the way, that the movie didn't explain, just to let you know, the white man who comes at the end to take him home is his cousin, just in case you didn't know. I know, because you probably wonder, what in the world would make this white man from Saratoga take his ass down to the South to bring this brother home? You think, man, that's one good-ass white man. But no. It's his, what it is his, the master in Rhode Island had children with enslaved as well as his family, and he was very rare. When he died, he manumitted them, and he publicly acknowledged his children. And as a consequence, the whites and the blacks from that plantation knew each other were relatives, okay? And one of the things you may not know, just to give you an idea, a lot of the early settlements in the United States did not make it through a winter, and in some cases, they didn't make it at all, even through the summers, because of drought. Why? Because you see, when they came to the States, they thought it was, at first, especially New England, they thought it was going to be like England, but England is fed with warm waters from the Gulf of Mexico. So it rains a lot there, so it's easier to farm. You come to the Americas, you have droughts, you have all kinds of stuff, you're not going to make it. However, a lot of Africa, and I go to the continent regularly, has conditions very similar to parts of North America. So the enslaved people had already developed the technologies of how to farm under those conditions. And that's why farms that had African slaves tended to prosper. So once you begin to realize that, now you see what's going on? That master's house was actually built by the tools of the enslaved people. So the real question now is, what do you do? Well, if you're going to focus on the tearing down, that's the, that part. Well, if you tear down the house, you're going to still have a problem. Because you see, if you look at every theory of freedom, think about every theory of freedom you ever had. If you look at every mythic portrait of freedom, what happens after you fought against the emperor or the sheriff of Nottingham or whoever? If you look at every manifestation of it, you know what you have? An outdoor party. Am I wrong? Think of Star Wars, outdoor party. But now imagine you have the outdoor party. We've knocked, Mary, Mary, we've knocked down the blah, 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 the outdoor party. If the camera stays on, the party can't last forever. What do you want to do after you've celebrated the victory of getting rid of the oppressor, the dominator, etc.? The answer is, you want to go home. Now you see the problem? What if instead you use your tools, and you built another house? And when you built this other house, the master is still hanging out in his house, but you've built another house. And your other house is, I'm not that into Puff Daddy, but I love this video. You know the video where he moves into this affluent neighborhood and he throws a party, and Shaquille O'Neal and everybody's coming to the party, and right? So, you know, you build your mansion, and in the master's, in your mansion, this is what's going on. Or even this. But in the master's house, here's what's going on. Not a great party, is it? So eventually, people started going to your house. Yo, let me check it out. You know, in the Puff Daddy video, the old lady comes in. Yo, how you doing, Puff Daddy? We're going. And everybody, so the master's like saying, after a while, the master is like, yo, man, nobody's coming to my house. After a while, you know, eventually the party's going on, and out there you hear. You're like, what's going on? Oh, I'm just curious what's going on at the party. You want to come in? No, it's okay. Then eventually, you know, okay. What happens is that that master's house becomes irrelevant. You see, the issue is not the house in itself. It's the presupposition that that is the only legitimate house in which to live. The error we make is we fail to take on what Fanon argued, which is the task of building better houses. You know what I said before about why I wrote that book? I could be why center the guy who wrote the phallic book? Write a different book. Change the discourse. You see what I'm saying? The problem many of us make is this. Too many people say this. You know, we ought to have an alternative system. You know, we ought to write better theory. You notice people are always saying we ought to do something, and then they're looking for somebody else to do it. What the argument says is if you think something ought to be done, that is a message saying that you should be the one who should do it. Whether you succeed or fail, the point is you'll set the conditions. Now, why do I say this? If we go back to what I said about failure, and this is something very important. I got to say this to you because I'm an old man and there are young people in the room, and it's a moment for me to do my, well, you know, young folks, and it's my moment to give a little old man wisdom. When I was a young man, I look young, but I'm old. It's just genes. It's a unique genetic thing. In my family, when we get old, we look young. Yeah, you should see my 77-year-old uncle. I'm not kidding. He looks about 45. But anyway, I'm 53, if you want to know. You didn't believe me, huh? But anyway, so when I was your age, and even when I was a little older, in my 30s, I would say, we ought to do, let's do X, Y, and Z. And somebody older would say, no, it won't work. And I would say, why? And you know the answer is, right? We tried it. Haven't you heard that one? It won't work. We tried it. And then I would say, well, you know, let me try it. Why don't we try anyway? Now, I got to tell you, and I would say in the past 40 years, of the many institutions I've helped build, the many projects I was involved in, the movements such as Africana philosophy, Black existentialism, political philosophy, philosophy of liberation, decolonial studies, things that are linked into work in Africa, the Caribbean, the work I do in India, every single thing, I heard that story. And you know what? The number of times things didn't work were very few. I would say 98% of the time we were successful. Now, why? Well, you see, here's the thing people don't realize. What those people who said they tried and it didn't work, what they didn't realize was that they lived under different conditions than I live under. You see, when they tried it, it alerted the system to the fact that somebody wanted change. They didn't realize what they interpreted as their failure was not a failure. Because you see, the error, what made them think they failed was because they thought they had to be the ones in their action to experience the change. They didn't realize that by attempting to make change, those who are against change had to reorient themselves. And the moment you start reorienting yourself, it creates a chain reaction. And so by the time I was trying to do what they attempted, I was doing it under different conditions. I was doing it on the back of their original labor. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it's not that I changed it. It's that we changed it. It's just the change happened over time. If you think about the people in this country in the 18th and the 19th century, they had no reason to believe that a future could exist like this room. Pick, for instance, the question of women and the question of women and learning. There was a time where in this very building, this room right in front of us would not look like it does right now. It would exclusively be not even just white males, because a lot of the white males in this room wouldn't even fit the criteria. You wouldn't be white enough. You see what I'm getting at? But it's because people, women and men, fought against those things, because suddenly people saw there were women fighting for a very different world. Those women had no idea that this room would look the way it looks now. And even many of them who thought they failed, they don't realize they set the conditions for this change. So that means then, if we're talking about the question of social change, right? If we're talking about going beyond colonialism, what we have to understand, it's a lot like building that house. You don't know who's going to live in it, how it's going to, what is going to shift. But as long as you start setting those conditions, you have created foundations on which the future will rest. And this is the thing, and mind you, and here's the crucial thing, this is not optimism, because you could screw up. It's not pessimism either, because both optimism and pessimism require an epistemic relationship to the future. But this argument is saying you don't know the future. Harriet Tubman didn't know the future. Sojourner Truth didn't know the future. Frederick Douglass didn't know the future. I could go through the list. Phyllis Wheatley, Lemuel Haynes, Cugano, Amo, and I'm saying all these names because many of you don't know, but a lot of the people I mentioned, Cugano, for instance, was a philosopher who had a critique of David Hume, and he was in England. Okay, he was an enslaved man. Amo was from Ghana. Amo was a professor in the 18th century at the University of Halle. Okay? We could continue. Anna Julia Cooper, you should know. You know Anna Julia Cooper, right? You don't? I went to a meeting where people said that they were Pan-Africanists and they believe in intersectionality and feminism. I said, do you know who Anna Julia Cooper is? None of them knew. Anna Julia Cooper was one of the women who co-organized the first Pan-African Congress. But it's more than that. She was born a slave, and by the age of 10, she was teaching college mathematics when she was freed. Anna Julia Cooper went to Oberlin. She founded the M School that brought a whole lot of people into higher education, Native Americans and African Americans. She also did her PhD at the Sorbonne, and she wrote on what? The Haitian Revolution. Anna Julia Cooper was revolutionary. But then again, this is some of the things, and she was a philosopher. And in fact, she wrote one of the quintessential texts in black feminist thought of the 19th century. Now, when I bring up these people, these were foundations, because see, Anna Julia Cooper, I write on Anna Julia, to know even she existed, and the arguments she made worked their way into my work. A lot of those others too. In other words, when you build on your excellence, whatever it may be, that's going to be the foundation for others. And so the Fanonian argument then is a profoundly existential political dialectical argument. And this argument about building these alternative housing conditions, that is the place through which to focus. Because think about it. The people, as I said before, you didn't know this room would exist. But you know what? This is not the culmination. This is a stage. And we don't even know the kind of human beings that will occupy this room in the future. Because right now, because those changes have occurred, we are even changing our understanding of what it is to be human. And that's going to generate very unique, different questions to come. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you.